This is Dave with the Catalyst Research Group. Today we are going to be going over how to install the SIG Romeo M17 optic on either the M17 or the M18 Contract SIG Sauer pistols. I noticed that there's a lack of videos specific to how to install this optic on these specific firearms, and wanted to put this out there to maybe help some people through when they start picking up these contract guns and the Romeo M17 optic. So there's only one tool that you're going to need for the installation of this optic, and that is going to be a T15 size Torx wrench. So starting out, you're going to want to make sure that your firearm is clear and unloaded, and then you will want to field strip the firearm. Apologize, I'm working around my camera right now. So you can set the frame off to the side. Once you have the slide off of the frame, I prefer to remove the recoil spring and the barrel just to get it out of the way. Now what we're going to be looking at here is the back of the slide itself. You have your back plate, and then you have a plunger right here which retains the back plate. This plunger is a little bit different than your typical SIG P320. On the typical P320, you can just depress the plunger and then slide the plate off of the slide. On the contract guns, you have a T15 size Torx back here that needs to be rotated and unlocked in order to remove the back plate. So what you'll want to do is depress the plunger and rotate to the left, and that plunger will pop out just slightly. Now that plunger will ultimately slide out of the slide. You don't need to remove it right now, but in order to remove this back plate with that plunger unlocked, you're going to need to push it in, and then you can slide the back plate off. And here you see the plunger comes out. You can continue sliding off that back plate and set that to the side. I'll keep those together. There are other components that are inside of the plunger hole right here that hold in the extractor on the firearm. The Romeo M17 instructions say to remove all of those components. I found that it's not necessary. You can actually leave the head of the plunger in the slide as well, and you're able to complete the installation of the optic. So from here, you're going to want to remove your striker assembly. You can just set that off to the side, and what that does is it exposes the screw that holds in your rear sight and the optic cover plate back here. This is also different from your commercial variants of the P320, M17, and M18 pistols that do not use this single screw mounting solution for the optic. So next step is going to be to remove your rear sight and the optic cover plate. This is also the T15 Torx, and you just go ahead and unscrew that single screw. Once you have the single screw out, you rotate the slide back up the right way. When I remove that screw, I like to keep my hand over this rear sight, and you will notice that the rear sight is a separate piece from the optic plate. you're going to need this rear sight when you install the Romeo M17 optic onto the slide. When you're removing the optic cover plate, one thing you're going to want to be careful of is the loaded chamber indicator. This right here next to the breech face. It's being held in place by the optic cover plate. And when you install the optic, it will also retain that loaded chamber indicator. It's under spring tension, though it's very slight spring tension, but it can and does have the potential to fly off the firearm if you're not careful. So I like to just retain it with my finger and remove the plate, which you can set off to the side. So under this plate, you'll see the loaded chamber indicator right there. It has these two little tabs. And then if you remove it, you'll notice that this isn't really focusing that well, but you'll notice it has a spring attached to the tail end of it right there. You want to leave this in place on the slide, right where it already was. So when you look at how they are securing this optic to this model of firearm, besides the single screw that holds it down in the back, you'll notice on the front of the optic it has these two little tabs right here. Those tabs fit into the front of the cutout for the optic and help retain the front side of the optic to the slide. And this is supposed to give it a much more solid mounting solution to the firearm, especially if you're used to like the Glock MOS style of mounting optics to a slide where you have a mounting plate that's just screwed in from the top onto the slide. So this is supposed to be a much better solution and prevent your optic from being able to come off the firearm if you're, racking your firearm off of a barrier, your belt or something like that, or just from dropping the firearm or rough handling it. So from here, the instructions say to clean off this whole area in your cutout. I just found that it has a light layer of like packing oil or packing grease applied to it. I don't really see a need to wipe that down. I mean, you can if you want to, but I don't think it's 100% necessary. So once you have that plate off, you're going to want to slide the optic in. You're going to come in at a slight angle, and you're going to get those tabs underneath of the front edge of that cutout. And then the optic's just going to rock down into place. You'll be able to tell very easily if you have it seated correctly because it's going to fit perfectly into that cutout with the rear tab going over where that rear sight is going to go. From here, you take your rear sight that you removed initially, and it goes right in the same type of slot that the optic plate cover had on the rear. Just make sure that you have it oriented correctly with your two night sight side facing the rear of the firearm. From there, make sure you retain the rear sight, rotate the slide upside down, and then they provide a new screw to be able to secure the optic in the rear sight to the firearm. Now, one thing that I noticed is when they ship the Romeo M17, they supply Loctite 271, which is the more permanent red Loctite variant. This is the one that they recommend to use for that screw to secure the rear sight and the optic. I normally prefer using blue Loctite, or I also use another type that comes with, you know, different types of holsters and things. There are different companies use this called Vibratite, and this one's 121. I think that you'd be pretty good using either one of these. If you're going to use the Loctite 271, just remember that a lot of times it's going to require using heat in order to break the bond that it forms and to be able to remove it. So this is, if you're going to be installing the optic on the slide and you're not planning on removing it anytime soon and want the most permanent mounting solution for it, go ahead and use the 271. But otherwise, I think, you know, if you're just testing it out and you're planning on maybe switching between different optics, definitely go with a version of or something similar to blue Loctite that will allow you to remove that screw a little bit easier. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to use the 271 because I'm not planning on removing this optic from this firearm anytime soon. So I'm just going to get this opened up real quick. Now, one thing that I found with using any type of Loctite is people usually use way too much of it on the screw. So you don't hardly need that much on your screw threads. I just touched it to the end of the red Loctite, and that's probably even more than what's going to be required to be able to get the job done. So let me just get this on the end of the Torx, and then we will get this installed. So remember to hold on to that rear sight. And I'm just going to get that screw right in there and tighten it down. When I was reviewing the installation instructions, I didn't see anything about how many foot-pounds to torque the screw to. I'm just going to tighten it down hand tight. I'm not going to apply too much pressure to it to try and, you know, crank it down any more than is necessary. Just to check it out. The rear sight, there's no movement in it. There's no movement in the optic. And with a combination of that and the red thread locker, I don't think that that's going to go anywhere. But, you know, when you do any type of install of anything like this, those first few times at the range, really pay attention to see if anything is loosening up. If it is, then that's something that, you know, you need to address so that you don't end up losing parts of your firearm. But I'm guessing that this isn't going to have any problems with loosening up. So once you have that installed, it's just a matter of reinstalling all of the parts into your firearm. So for the striker assembly, just going to slide that right back in there. It only goes in one direction, so there's not really any way to screw that up. And then if you removed the plunger, you're going to want to put that back in first. What I do is I just kind of slide that in there. It'll be sticking out just slightly. Make sure that it will depress, and just press on it with your thumb and feel that spring tension on it. And then I will kind of prepare the installation of this back plate. I'll put it into position. If any of you are familiar with disassembling Glocks, it's a very similar concept where the rear end of the striker assembly is pressing out a little bit under spring tension, and you can't just slide this rear plate on over top of it. It does require that you push the striker assembly in slightly in order to get that rear plate on. So let me see if I can get this on in view of the camera for you. It might just be a little bit out of view. You're gonna have to turn it up a little bit. So what I'm using is just the end of the Torx to push down on the rear of the striker assembly. To try and get this rear plate to slide on. And you may have to move around the plunger a little bit because it also has to be lined up just right. So what I had to do there is off the screen is I had to rotate the plunger a little bit to the left, and it allowed me to slide that rear plate on when I was pressing down on the back of the striker assembly. So you'll notice the rear plate will stop just slightly away from going completely on. So what you're going to do from here is you're going to just have to kind of play around with this plunger, push it in, and I just rotate it until I find the correct slot and I'm able to slide the rear plate all the way into position. With that rear plate in position, you'll notice the plunger is still protruding a little bit from the rear of the slide. And what I will do is the exact opposite of when I was taking it apart. So I'll push it in and rotate it to the right. You'll notice that it has caught. It is now almost entirely flush with the rear of the slide. And then if you just rotate it to the right, you'll feel it stop. And at that point, that plunger is completely installed in the rear of the slide. So from here, you're going to reinstall your barrel and your recoil spring, and then reinstall this onto the firearm. And one thing that I will do is a function test of the firearm anytime I disassemble it and then reassemble it or do any type of changes to anything on the firearm. I want to make sure that it is going to function correctly. And just to make sure, again, no magazine in the firearm and nothing in the chamber. I'm going to drop the slide. This is pointed in a safe direction. I'm going to pull the trigger. All right, hear the reset. Pull the trigger again. I'm going to utilize a safety, confirm that it's still working, and then that is it. So that is how you install the Romeo M17 optic onto both the M17 or the M18 Contract pistols. And those are going to be the TC serial number M18s or the TF serial number M17s. If you all have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. I'd be more than happy to answer whatever questions you have. If you have any suggestions or recommendations on a different way or a better way to install the optic, please let me know as well. I haven't installed a ton of these optics, but I did notice there was just a lack of videos specifically on how to install this specific optic on these specific models of pistols. So thank you all for watching, and If you could, this is my first video on this channel, so if you could like and subscribe, that would be great. It's always really appreciated.